Hello and good morning to those of you joining us on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you joining us today from the East Coast. Welcome to all of you, and thank you all so much for taking the time today to join us for this brief continuing education webinar on how to negotiate or renegotiate the terms and rental rates in your veterinary office lease agreement. My name is Brendan Madden. I'm one of our senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group. And basically what it is that I do on a daily basis is I strategize and consult with doctors across the country who are looking to either start a new practice, open a second location, look to renegotiate or renew their lease agreement in their existing location, or doctors who are preparing for a transition from veterinary medicine and looking to ensure that the lease agreement is properly structured in order to support those endeavors. So again, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Again, will be a fairly brief continuing education webinar over the next 45 to 60 minutes. My goal is that all of you will gain a better understanding of commercial real estate, but more importantly, a better understanding as to how your lease agreement affects and can affect you and the practice or the clinic. A little bit of an agenda for the presentation today. For those of you who are not aware or who may have not joined us for a continuing education course in the past, I'd like to go through some background on who it is that we are here at Cirrus and what it is that we do on a regular basis. I will go through some quite alarming industry trends that have come about fairly recently. As well, I would like all of you to gain a better understanding today as to why the lease is so important to both yourselves and your practices. I will walk you through some of the $100,000 or more traps that can be and are typically hidden in lease agreements. I will go through some of the key considerations to take into account when we are looking to either open a second office, open our first practice, or if we're looking to buy or sell a veterinary clinic. We'll go through what we have coined the tenant lease cycle and some timelines, some critical timelines to be aware of as it relates to your lease agreement. We will walk you through our proven 8-step process for winning a negotiation, those 8 steps that we typically go through when we are engaged to help a doctor with their lease agreement, either a brand new lease or helping them to renegotiate those economic and legal terms and provisions in the lease agreement. And finally, time permitting, I do hope to get to some questions and answers, which will be online at the end of the presentation, again, time permitting. Of course, if we are unable to get to some question and answers at the end of the presentation, I will leave my contact information up so that any of you can feel free to, at any time, give me a call or send me an email with any questions that you may have regarding your specific situation or your specific office lease agreement. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, here are a couple of interesting and also concerning facts that some of you may not be aware of. The first being that, unfortunately, over 75% of veterinarians, so yourselves and your colleagues, have signed a lease agreement that can prevent them from ever transferring their lease and therefore ever selling their veterinary clinic due to unwarranted landlord interference. Animal health practitioners who engage in lease renewal negotiations without ever understanding those complex lease provisions typically end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary rent increases throughout the life of their careers or the life of the lease agreements that they have signed. I like to say that, unfortunately, we don't know what we don't know. And if we enter into a negotiation missing key pieces of information that could add significant leverage to our side of the table, we may end up, missing out on certain wins in the negotiation, which therefore could end up costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars over the life of the lease agreement or our careers. So extremely critical that we are knowledgeable about commercial real estate in general, but more specifically about the lease agreement and how it relates and how it can affect our veterinary clinics and ourselves personally, as well as our families or estate. And finally, a little bit of a more positive piece of information that all of you should be aware of. We as healthcare practitioners are actually one of, if not the least risky type of commercial tenant that a landlord can have. And therefore, we tend to be one of, if not the most coveted commercial tenants for a property manager or property owner. Reason being, we as healthcare practitioners tend to have very low default and bankruptcy rates, right? As in relation to a more typical or traditional retail establishment, veterinary clinics have very low default and bankruptcy rates, and therefore are some of the least risky types of commercial tenants that a landlord can have in their space. We make significant investments into the leasehold improvements in the space when we go about building out our veterinary clinic to begin with. We tend to, as a veterinary clinic, significantly increase the foot traffic, and we offer vital services to not only the plaza or building in which our practice is housed, but to the community overall, which makes us, again, very coveted tenants to a landlord or property manager. And it's important to keep this in mind anytime that we do enter into a negotiation with the landlord, because this does add leverage to our side of the table. And then finally, due to our long-term periods of tenancy, typically healthcare practitioners will remain in a location for 20, 30, even 40 years, but not only the current doctor will be in the space for a long period of time, but the doctor who inherits or purchases the practice tends not to relocate that existing clinic, and therefore clinics can remain in the same space for upwards of a century, depending on the building and the clinic. So this adds long-term stability and predictability for a landlord in order to have us as healthcare practitioners in their building and in their space. So again, to reiterate, keep this in mind when we do enter into any form of negotiation with the landlord. We do, as healthcare practitioners, as veterinarians, have significant leverage on our side of the table in the negotiation. For those of you who may not have joined us for a continuing education seminar or webinar in the past, I would like to go through a little bit of background on who it is that we are and what it is that we do here at Cirrus. So a few points up there on this slide, and we are here at Cirrus a tenant representation firm. Right? We were founded by healthcare professionals in 1994. So we've been in business now for 23 going on 24 years. And we represent healthcare professionals in commercial real estate matters, but primarily the negotiation of office lease agreements. We do here at Cirrus have an in-house legal team comprised of real estate attorneys. We have an in-house leasing team comprised of former commercial real estate brokers and analysts, and those are the teams that provide us with the lease negotiations as well as market research across the country in terms of going rental rates, property availabilities, landlord information, etc. We analyze thousands of office lease agreements each year, and in 2016 we represented over 1,000 healthcare practitioners in their lease negotiations. To date, we have negotiated over 10,000 healthcare office lease agreements. And on an annual basis, we conduct over 150 educational seminars, both in person and online, similar to this webinar. And we do have the fortunate position of being the premier healthcare tenant representation firm for veterinarians in all of North America. So that you have a little bit of an idea as to where it is that we tend to represent clients, I thought that I would pull up this slide showing you a few of the clients that we have worked with across the country this year and in the recent future. And it also demonstrates to you that the inherent problems that we will discuss today in the office lease agreement that you need to be aware of are not specific to a certain state or a certain area in the country. These problems arise and these inherent liabilities exist in lease agreements all across the country. And unfortunately, we tend to find that the issues that we will discuss today are seen in landlord's lease agreements in all states across North America. Now, I always like to ask this question, and especially in a live seminar, but I will pose this to all of you in attendance today as well. The question, what is a lease agreement? And I will allow you a moment or two to give that some thought. Typically, when I pose this question in a seminar that I'm conducting live in a room with doctors, I'll get common answers similar to, the lease agreement is a contract between yourselves and the landlord, or the lease agreement is an agreement outlining certain terms and provisions which outline the relationship or marriage between you and the landlord. And often I will hear that a lease agreement shows the rent that you will pay for your space. Now, these are all accurate answers, but today I'd like you to think about a lease agreement from a little bit of a different perspective than perhaps you are used to thinking about a lease agreement. And I would argue today that the lease agreement that many of you have signed or will sign in the future is arguably the most or the largest check that you will ever sign in your lives. So take a minute to think about what it is that I just said. The lease agreement is likely one of, if not the largest checks that you will ever sign in not only your careers, but your lives. Right? And if someone posed the lease agreement to you in that light prior to ever signing the lease agreement, would you not have, as opposed to reviewing the first few pages of the lease, looked through and read through with a fine-tooth comb every page, every provision of the lease agreement to ensure that what you were signing was fair and did not have any inherent potential liabilities to you in the future? Now, why is the lease agreement so important to ourselves as veterinarians? There's a few different reasons that the lease is so important to us and our clinics. The first reason being the significant capital expenditure or investment that we make into the space upon the commencement of our careers or our building out of our first clinic. Typically, we make a very significant cost investment into the build out of the clinic, and without a space to practice or without a space to house our clinic, we don't have anywhere to practice, and we would not be able to produce veterinary services. So it really is the foundation of our practice. Without a lease agreement in place, typically we, again, don't have anywhere to practice. So it's extremely important that prior to signing the lease agreement for your practice, we ensure that it is a solid foundation upon which we can continue to build the practice, grow production, and meet those goals that we have for ourselves, for our clinic, and for our careers. The veterinary clinic tends to be very difficult to move. If any of you joining us today have gone through the process of relocating a veterinary clinic, as you are well aware, it's very difficult, very time-consuming, and not to mention very costly for us to relocate or move a veterinary clinic. So it's absolutely critical that the lease agreement is properly structured to support a long-term tenancy and a long career in the space that we find suitable to open our practice in. Right? If we have to move the practice for whatever reason, relocate the veterinary clinic to another space, we run the risk of facing patient attrition, if not significant patient attrition, and again, another reason why the lease is so important and really the foundation of our practice. So what are some of the benefits then of a properly structured lease agreement for the practice? Well, number one, if the lease agreement is negotiated and structured properly, it will provide us with fair and affordable financial terms, right? So this includes the rent that we're paying for the space, the additional rent or operating expenses that we may have to pay for the space, as well as any free rent periods, any tenant inducement allowances provided by the landlord, and economic considerations. So if the lease agreement is properly negotiated, we set ourselves up to build the practice from a foundation which is fair and solid to allow us to obtain and attain those goals that we have for the practice for production and patient attraction. Secondly, the lease agreement, if properly negotiated, will provide us with long-term stability and security in our space. Right? Unfortunately, a lot of your colleagues whose lease agreements we review on a regular basis have structured the lease agreement so that the initial term is a 5-year term, and many of your colleagues will obtain a 5-year option to renew the lease. Now, the downside to structuring a lease agreement in this way is it does not provide us with the stability and security for the remainder of our career in the given space that our clinic is housed. So we recommend at Cirrus, and it does vary in some situations, but most often we recommend doctors to obtain a 10-year initial term plus 2 or 3 options to renew the lease agreement, and this provides us a few alternatives. First of all, it provides us with long-term predictability and stability in the space. But secondly, it increases the leverage that we have to negotiate with our landlord, both more favorable economic terms, but also those legal terms and provisions that we need to ensure are drafted correctly in the lease agreement. Because when we sign on for a longer term, the landlord is typically more amenable to negotiating the financials and the non-financial terms and provisions of the lease agreement. Right. Number 3, the lease agreement should minimize our risk and any exposure that we have. The way that we do this, and unfortunately a lot of your colleagues are not structuring their lease agreement in this way. I know most of you joining us today likely have some form of corporation or corporate entity set up for your veterinary clinic. But unfortunately, the majority of us have signed the lease agreement personally and not in the name of our corporate entity, our LLC, our S-Corp, or our PC. And this leaves you exposed to significant personal liability under the lease agreement. So ideally, we remove ourselves personally from the lease. We do not provide any form of personal guarantee, and the only entity on the lease agreement is our corporate entity. Right? That is the ideal position. If we do need to negotiate limitations on a personal guarantee with the landlord, that is an alternative route. But so that you all are aware, we should only have the corporate entity on the lease, and we should not be on the lease agreement anywhere ourselves personally. Therefore, minimizing significantly any potential risk that we have under the lease and any exposure to potential liabilities in the future. Fourth, the lease agreement should maximize the flexibility that you have to do what you wish with your clinic. And a good example of ensuring the lease is properly structured to maximize your flexibility is by incorporating an article called the Death and Disability provision into the lease agreement. What the Death and Disability provision would allow you is, in the event that, God forbid, something were to happen to you and you were to become sick, injured, or pass away, you would have the right to terminate the lease agreement and sell the practice, or your estate would have that same right to terminate the lease agreement and sell the practice. So important, as healthcare professionals that in order to maximize our flexibility under the lease agreement, it is properly structured and we have certain provisions that will increase the flexibility we have under the lease. And if we are able to properly negotiate and properly structure the lease agreement, it's going to, as opposed to acting as a liability when you look to sell your clinic, will act as an asset and add value to the sale of your clinic when you do eventually sell the practice and transition from veterinary medicine. Now, jumping into some of those items that are found in lease agreements so that you can see specific examples. The first item that I would like to go through with all of you is entitled the Option to Renew article. This is found in 90% of the lease agreements that we review verbatim as it is written as you see on the screen. Therefore, statistically speaking, 90% of those of you in attendance today will have an option to renew article structured exactly as this is structured the way you see in front of you, or very similar with slight alterations. So I will give you all a minute or two to review this article and pull out any red flags that you might see in this article, and I will walk you through those red flags that are existing in this option to renew article and some ways to mitigate any potential exposure. So if you've all taken a minute to review this article, I hope that you were able to pull out some of the inherent red flags that exist within this article. And I encourage you, after the continuing education course today, take a look at your lease agreements for any similar language that may pose as problems to you in the future, either in the short term or in the long term when we're looking to sell the practice. And the first red flag is existing in the very first sentence of this option to renew article. As you can see, it states that provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. The problem that arises when an article is structured similar to this is this option to renew is personal to Dr. Joe Black, the tenant in the space. And in some of your lease agreements, it may not list your name and it may not list your corporate entity. In fact, it will state provided that tenant. And as you can see, tenant in this option to renew article is capitalized. There is a capital T. This means that tenant is a defined term in the lease agreement, and tenant in this case is defined as Dr. Joe Black. Therefore, this option to renew is non-transferable to any purchaser of Dr. Joe Black's veterinary clinic or any successor under the lease agreement following Dr. Joe Black. It goes on to state that, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. Now, as you may have noticed, default has a capital D, which again means that default is a defined term within the lease agreement. Now, typically, doctors and your colleagues believe that an event of default will only occur if you, for example, miss a rental payment or do not pay rent for a certain month or a certain time period. Now, unfortunately, the definition for default and the default provision in most lease agreements is anywhere from 1 to 5 full pages long. And in our experience, I actually worked with a veterinarian in South Florida last year who unfortunately, due to certain circumstances, needed to renew her lease agreement, and the landlord, upon request to renew the lease, stated that unfortunately we are not going to renew the lease agreement for you and we are not going to extend the lease. And our doctor was quite surprised at this and had felt that she had never defaulted under the lease agreement in the past, and was quite concerned as to why the landlord was not renewing the lease agreement for a period moving forward. And the landlord quite frankly stated that for the life of the lease agreement, you have been in frequent default of the lease, and provided her with a picture of the door entering into her practice, which outlined the hours of operation of the business. Now, unfortunately, this contradicted the hours of operation term in the lease agreement under the default provision, and the landlord notified our client that they were in frequent default of the lease, and therefore the landlord did not have to allow them to exercise the option and renew the lease agreement. So important that if we see any language similar to that in front of you in the lease, we understand exactly what it is that it means for us in the short term as well as in the long term. It goes on in this article to state that any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease agreement. Now, the reason that this poses a problem, if those of you in attendance did not catch it, is, say for example, we had gone through a significant negotiation with the landlord when we started the practice, and we were able to obtain a lease agreement that we had believed was ideal for us in the practice and would work perfectly for the life of our career. If this type of language, as you see in front of you, exists in your renewal option, it means that those terms and provisions that we had originally negotiated could be thrown out the window, and the landlord would have the ability to provide us with a standard form lease, which we would have to sign in order to exercise our renewal option. Therefore, tossing all of those items we had negotiated out the window. So important that any renewals will take into consideration those terms and provisions already existing or non-existent in the lease agreement, and that we are not obligated to sign a new standard form lease upon renewal. This red flag should have jumped out at the most of you. It states that in no event upon a renewal shall it be the rent be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Now, this type of language needs to be removed from any option articles that you have existing in your current lease agreements. The reason being, rental rates and markets fluctuate, and if, for example, prior to renewing our lease agreement, we experienced a recession or an event similar to 2008 and 2009, and rental rates across the country decreased, if we have this type of language that states that our rent cannot be less than in the last year of the original term, we are unable to partake in the lower rental rates that exist across the country, and we would have to renew at a significant premium to that of the market. So absolutely critical that language which states our rent cannot in any event decrease is removed or stricken from your lease agreements. Finally, it states that the rent shall be based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. Now, the issue that arises is the fact that it states renewing tenants in the building. This does not take into account our history of being a tenant in the building, our significant investment made into the space, and the fact that we are a coveted tenant in the space. This also means that if there are any renewing tenants in the building who are paying rent that is higher than that which we determine to be fair market rent, the rent that we pay in the renewal term will be based on those rents which are higher than that which we determined as fair market rent. So absolutely critical that we remove any type of language that states the rent must be similar or based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. And this should be structured and redrafted in a way that protects you and ensures that you're able to obtain fair and affordable rental rates and economics under your lease agreement moving forward. Now, we are moving on to an article in most of your lease agreements which is entitled the assignment article, or alternatively the assignment and subletting article. The article as you see it drafted in front of you is found in about 3/4 or 75% of veterinary office lease agreements. And so I will give you all again a minute to go through this article and pull apart any potential red flags that you found within the article. So if you've all had a chance to quickly go through the assignment article shown in front of you, the first red flag that is shown is where it states, "It shall first have received the consent of the landlord." So this assignment article is dealing with the transferability of your lease agreement in connection with the sale of your veterinary clinic, right? And as you can read along, it states that if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the leased premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. In some of your assignment articles in your specific lease agreements, it may go on to state which consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. Now, the red flag or the problem that arises from language like this in an assignment article is it's unclear as to what would allow the landlord to grant consent or deny consent to a transfer of our lease agreement and therefore the sale of our veterinary clinic. Unfortunately, more and more often across the country, we are seeing landlords leverage this type of language and this ability to control the transfer of the lease agreement to either request from the selling doctor a certain proceed of the sale of the clinic, or will request that the selling doctor convinces the buyer to pay a premium in rent. So, for example, a 20, 25, or 30% increase in the rental obligations moving forward. Now, we can all see how this would likely pose a problem when we are selling the practice and we've found a buyer. And it's absolutely critical that we get ahead of these types of problems and ensure that the assignment article is properly structured so that you can sell the practice and transfer the lease with the flexibility that you deserve. Okay, it goes on to state that within 15 days after the receipt by landlord of such request for consent to a transfer, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate the lease or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the leased premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. Now, most of you are probably able to point out where the red flags arise in this type of language, but unfortunately, in, again, 3/4 of your assignment provisions, there will be language identical to the way this is stated as you see in front of you. And if the landlord has the option to terminate our lease agreement or increase the rent for the buyer of our practice, you can see how this would pose a significant issue at the end of our career when we are looking to sell the practice and transition from veterinary medicine. Finally, and unfortunately, in the majority of your lease agreements in the assignment section, there will be language similar to what you see in front of you, which states, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under this lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Basically, what this language is stating is that the selling doctor will remain a guarantor for the purchaser of the practice, right? So will remain liable for the payment of any rent or the fulfillment of any terms and provisions or obligations under the lease agreement. Now, ideally, any language that states that we are to remain continuously liable or a guarantor for the buyer should be stricken from the lease agreement, and ideally we are removed completely from any liability under the lease after we've sold the practice. If we are unable to completely remove our continuing liability after sale, it's very important that we significantly limit this personal exposure or exposure after the sale of our practice. Now, unfortunately, we today on this 60-minute webinar don't have the time to go through all of those articles that are existent in your lease agreements and lease agreements across the country, which could pose significant issues. As you see in front of you, there are a significant number of articles that can either act as liabilities to you in your lease, or if properly structured, can act as assets for you and the lease agreement. You can see some of them in front of you, and a couple of articles to note are the demolition article and the relocation article. I would encourage all of you to review your current lease agreements or any proposed lease agreements that you are looking to sign to ensure that there are no redevelopment, demolition, or relocation provisions within the lease. These are and can be quite detrimental to a veterinary clinic, and therefore it's important to be aware if they do exist in our lease and how they are structured in the lease agreement. Briefly, the demolition provision would allow the landlord, upon a proposed redevelopment of the building, to terminate your lease agreement upon typically 30, 60, or 90 days notice. And the relocation provision, very similarly, upon 30, 60, or 90 days notice, the landlord would have the right to relocate your practice from the space that you're in to a different space in the building, and often the new build-out of the new space is not covered by the landlord. It is to be borne by you, the tenant. Now, I mentioned in our agenda that we would go through some of the key items and components to be aware of when looking to start a veterinary clinic and looking to sign either a new lease agreement or a lease agreement for the very first time. Now, of course, rental rates need to be taken into consideration, as well as the economic structure of the deal. And there are ways to be creative when we're looking to start a clinic with regard to the economics and the way that they are structured. Also important to take into account any tenant improvement allowance that the landlord is providing to us to build out our space, to ensure that it is properly fixtured, and to ensure that construction is completed in our space prior to us entering and beginning to produce veterinary medicine. So important to keep in mind any tenant improvements or tenant inducements that the landlord will provide to us. Thirdly, we need to ensure that we are negotiating a fixturing period or a free rent period under the lease agreement when we're looking to start a practice. This fixturing period would allow us the time to design and build the space prior to us having to pay rent or additional expenses in the space. And finally, and most importantly, it's absolutely critical that those lease terms and conditions included in the lease agreement are properly structured to support you through the life of your career, but will also protect you personally and the practice, provide you with the flexibility that you deserve throughout the lease, as well as the flexibility to sell the clinic when it is that you choose, while ensuring that you obtain the maximum value for the sale of the clinic. Some of the items to take into consideration when buying or selling a clinic. We need to ensure that there is lots of term on the lease agreement. Firstly, to ensure that any buyer is able to obtain financing for the purchase of the clinic. And secondly, to ensure that the buyer has predictability and longevity in the space. Along the same lines, it's important to ensure that we have options to renew the lease agreement that will give us the flexibility to continue to practice in the space if we choose to do so, but not only ensuring that we have options to renew, but ensuring that those options are transferable to any buyer of the practice. Ideally, we completely remove any form of personal guarantees under the lease agreement and remove, again, any continuing liability to the seller upon sale and transfer of the lease. Well before buying or selling a clinic, we need to ensure that the assignment article within the lease is properly structured to facilitate that sale and to ensure that the landlord will not have the right to request proceeds of sale or for the buyer to pay a premium on the rental rate under the lease. And finally, it's absolutely critical, and all of you should have a death and disability article in your lease agreements, and ensuring that that death and disability article is transferable to any successor under the lease agreement. So one of the more important items to note is the timeline to be considerate of. At Cirrus, we highly encourage doctors to begin the negotiation process 24 months prior to a renewal or expiry date. Every day that goes by after we hit that 24-month or 2-year prior to expiry, we lose leverage in negotiations with the landlord, because most landlords are aware that it takes, call it a year to potentially a year and a half to relocate a veterinary clinic. And if we approach them with 6 or 3 months left of term on the lease, we have very little leverage to negotiate a favorable deal, because they know that it would be very difficult for us to relocate the practice given the time that we have. And again, I would like to reiterate, it's extremely critical to begin negotiations and the negotiation process with your landlord 24 months or 2 years prior to a renewal or expiry of the lease agreement. Now, what is the process that Cirrus takes when we enter into a negotiation? What is the right treatment plan for winning a negotiation? This 8-step process is the process that we tend to follow, and it has been extremely successful for us over our tenure. The first step that we take in a negotiation is ensuring that we've gathered all pertinent documentation. So ensuring that we have a copy of not only the lease agreement, but any other documents relating to the lease. Any amendments, any addendums, any riders to the lease agreement, any exhibits, etc. We need to ensure that we've gathered all documentation and we have it properly organized so that we can review appropriately that documentation. Secondly, we need to identify what are our practice and career goals. What are our short-term and our long-term goals for the practice and for our career? Following that, we review with a fine-tooth comb the documentation related to the lease agreement as well as the lease agreement to pull any potential red flags or inherent liabilities that exist within the lease agreement, following which we will ensure that we've done our market research on the landlord, on the building, on the area in terms of property availabilities and going fair market rental rates. And finally, or step 5, we develop an outcome and a strategy plan. Basically, what is the ideal goals for the negotiation and what would be the absolute ideal outcome? Following the determination of the strategy for the negotiation, You can notice we have not done a critical aspect to the negotiation as of yet, and that is pick up the phone and call the landlord to begin negotiations. So after step 5 is when we begin to reach out to the landlord, and the first items we like to discuss are those items that the landlord also is interested in discussing, and those are the economics of the renewal or the negotiation. Following the economic discussion, we move into discussing and amending those legal terms and provisions that we need to amend in order to protect our clients and ensure a properly and well-negotiated lease agreement. And finally and critically, we conduct a final review of the lease agreement once the landlord has agreed to the changes. We do this to ensure that the final document that is provided to us accurately reflects those changes that we had negotiated and accurately takes into account all items that we had discussed with the landlord. Some key takeaways from today's presentation, the first being the details in the lease can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. So I hope you all today have developed a little bit of a better understanding as to how important the lease agreement is to you and your practice, and the potential pitfalls or traps that it can cause. Secondly, it's not just about the rent. Of course, ensuring that we're paying fair and affordable rental rates is important, but I would argue that more importantly is that we properly structure those legal terms and provisions which could cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars if not structured correctly. And we need to minimize our risk personally under the lease agreement while maximizing the flexibility that we have to do with our practice what it is that we choose to do, while ensuring that we are maximizing sale value when that time does come, and throughout our career ensuring that we have peace of mind and longevity in the space. We need to be extremely strategic. Unfortunately, we don't get what we deserve in a negotiation. We get what we negotiate into the lease. So again, we need to be aware of those items that perhaps we were unfamiliar with, and we need to ensure that we are educated to conduct the negotiation in an appropriate and intelligent manner. Starting the process early is critical in allowing us to obtain a favorable outcome in the negotiation. Again, to reiterate, we should begin the process 24 months prior to a negotiation, and the closer we get to the expiry or renewal date, the less leverage we tend to have on our side. And finally, ensure that we're doing our homework and that we have developed a strategic plan of attack in the negotiation in order to obtain those items that we believe to be critical to our lease and our goals for the practice moving forward. Now, one of the services that Cirrus Consulting Group offers is a service called the Critical Dates and Risk Analysis. Basically, what this service entails is our firm analyzing your lease agreement for any potential traps or liabilities and walking you through exactly what red flags or traps exist in your lease agreement while providing you with a plan to ensure that these are strategically negotiated out of or restructured in your lease agreement. And today, thanks to Henry Schein Animal Health, who has covered the cost of our critical dates and risk analysis service, the first 5 of you in attendance who email me stating your desire for the service will actually obtain it complimentary, free of charge. So typically we charge $1,495 for that service, but for the first 5 of you who tell me that you would like the critical dates and risk analysis, thanks to Henry Schein Animal Health, those 5 of you will obtain it complimentary and free of charge. Now, unfortunately, given where we are in terms of time, we will not have many or much time to go through some question and answers, but what I will do is leave my contact information on the screen for you all to jot down. My email is listed there, and my toll-free line with my direct extension. If any of you have questions specific to your current situation or specific to your lease agreement, I am more than happy to address those questions. And again, for those of you who are interested in the complimentary lease review consultation, do send me an email within the next 24 hours, and the first 5 of you will obtain that service free of charge. So I would like to thank you all very much for joining us today over the past, call it 60 minutes or so, in this continuing education webinar on the veterinary office lease agreement. I hope that all of you have a little bit of a better understanding as to how the lease agreement affects you personally as well as the practice, and a better way to enter into negotiations with your landlord moving forward. Again, thank you all so much. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any specific questions, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.